So it was getting close to Christmas, and I wanted to post a few things to friends. I decided I wanted to create something to send to my parents. It had been quite a few years since I had made them anything. This drawing is quite a bit simpler and smaller than what I would usually create in terms of detail and amounts of plants or objects in the drawing. But it was actually really nice to work on an ink piece that was a bit quicker, and I really had quite a tight deadline before I wanted to post this. Recently, there have been lots of owls in the forest. I wake up most mornings at around 7 AM to an owl loudly hooting in the pine trees. In the evenings when dusk descends, I hear them too, and once I even saw the silhouette of one high up in a pine tree. I looked up which type of owl has been waking me up every morning based on the sound, and I'm pretty certain it's a tawny owl. They make such a lovely hooting and a kind of trilling sound. So although I don't live in a place that snows or with the correct climate, I decided I would draw 3 snowy owls huddled on a branch. Nearing the end of this video, I was thinking of sharing some folklore about owls, so that's something you can look forward to nearer the end. I thought as my process today is quite simple, I would talk a little bit about what life is like living in a forest every day, having previously lived in a city. Before I start, a few details about what I'm doing if you're new here. I'm a dip pen and ink artist and create lots of nature, folklore, fairy tale and animal-inspired illustrations, and sometimes paintings. I've also been dabbling in sculpting and doll making. I still need to actually edit a video of my doll making process, but this new endeavour has involved a lot of learning and thinking and research. There are so many different elements to making dolls, and I still haven't quite decided how I want to approach editing the footage I have so far. Recently, a lot of what I've been creating has actually been for other people, but I've been really feeling an itch to get back into my personal work again, so hopefully that will be something you see over the coming months. So I moved to Portugal and more or less into the middle of nowhere back in 2019, just before the pandemic. The timing couldn't have been better, I know. I often thought during that time how difficult life would have been for me if I still had to work and pay rent in the city, and how being in the forest really was the best place for me to be at that time. I live in a forest land that my partner and I bought. It is between 2 villages and surrounded by natural land. One of my favourite things about our forest is that it is essentially a nature reserve. The majority of the surrounding land is eucalyptus, grown for paper production, I believe. This is actually really bad for the environment and essentially creates what is called a green desert. It means the wildlife lacks the diversity it needs to thrive. And not only that, but the roots of eucalyptus trees can span up to 30 meters, and they really deplete the soil of its water and nutrients. This makes it much harder for other plants to thrive. The soil in these forests always becomes extremely sandy and crumbly, which I've experienced firsthand. But really, probably the worst thing about eucalyptus is how it causes wildfires to spread at an alarming speed, providing very flammable kindling for miles and miles and miles due to the natural oils that the tree produces. Every summer, we check fires more regularly than most people check the weather. It is something we always have to be prepared for, especially when it hasn't rained properly for months and months. It is definitely one of the harder things about living here. Thankfully, I believe it has now been outlawed to plant new eucalyptus for production, but unfortunately the already established trees easily spread and grow back with a vengeance after they are cut. Our land, however, only actually has a few eucalyptus trees near the boundaries where they have just naturally spread. And the rest of our land is full of cork trees, oak and pine primarily, as well as many different kinds of bushes that produce lots of berries that feed all the birds and insects. This means that our land has so much wildlife, and even to this day I'm discovering new creatures I didn't know were here previously. One of my favourite memories of this is when I was sitting in a little spot higher up in our land for a while, and I heard a rustling and suddenly this bright red squirrel appeared. I had no idea we had any squirrels, and a red one. In the UK, squirrels became almost extinct except for a few places, because grey squirrels actually carry a disease which doesn't appear to affect them but often kills red squirrels. grey squirrels will also eat unripened acorns, so will often deplete food sources before the red squirrels can harvest any. Red squirrels will also breed less when under stress, so all of that to say I was very excited to see one. The forest is always full of surprises, good and bad. Which brings me on to my life here every day. I've grown so used to living primarily outdoors that I'm not sure I could easily adjust to living in an apartment again. Even a house with a garden feels like it would be too restrictive, I guess, depending on the size of the garden. I've never liked having neighbours, as in sort of right next to me. I love the idea of knowing I have this huge space surrounding me that is no one else's but my own. Growing up, I loved reading about the Bronte sisters, and I always thought it was so amazing that their home, which was a parsonage, opened up straight onto the Haworth moors, with a graveyard and church in front of them, and then the village of Haworth stretching beyond. I used to longingly look out of my bedroom window and wish the garden had an old wooden door that led to a path completely in the middle of nowhere, kind of like the secret garden or something. So I live off-grid, although I can't claim to live off of the land exactly. That I think a lot of people don't realise that that is essentially a full-time job, and is a huge endeavour. I do grow some vegetables and I have some fruit trees too, but a lot of that is dependent on drought and if our stream starts in the spring or not. You would probably be quite shocked how much water you need to keep vegetables growing and producing. It is really a lot of water. My workspace that you see in my videos is in a little caravan, which for the first 2 years of us being here was our only home and shelter. I might make a video one day talking about those first 2 years. Every morning I wake up and when I step outside I am immediately in the depths of nature. And sometimes this is almost magically beautiful, and other times it can feel quite brutal. We are very much at the mercy of the elements. We get a lot more sun here than in the UK, so often winter can be really lovely. This year in particular, it's been quite cold, but we have had so many sunny days. Often though, winter here can feel like never-ending heavy rain, and sometimes being so close to the Atlantic means we get some big storms as well. I find in Portugal it is either endlessly sunny or endlessly heavy rain, and there isn't much in between. I often feel quite nostalgic for England when we get some cloudy, overcast days. When it rains a lot at night, the fire salamanders come out, and you have to be very careful where you tread. We really love seeing these, and I get especially excited when a toad shows up in a pathway too. They always look like they have some wisdom to impart before heading back into the darkness of the bushes. I love how there is this perfect feeling of equilibrium in the forest. The toads and salamanders eat the excess snails and slugs, the birds eat the berries and insects, the eagles and owls eat the mice and rats, although we did just recently have to deal with a rat problem, and I'm honestly surprised it's taken this long for them to become a problem. We've actually had far more problems with ants and hornets than rodents. I think that's another thing too, the overwhelming feeling and knowledge that nature is always so ready to claim the forest as its own. Actually, it's funny, I was watching, I think, Fallout, and I noticed a scene where a character recognised some fabric that had been out in the open for maybe 10 to 15 years or something, and they could still see the pattern on the fabric. And having experienced how quickly things become so degraded from being left in the sun and rain here, that fabric would basically be non-existent after potentially even just a year. Certainly the fabric would have been completely faded in the location that it was in. I have really witnessed how quickly things rot and decay if they are left to the forest. Sometimes when it has been endlessly raining and I'm struggling with this feeling sometimes of almost unreality, I just remind myself that there are beautiful days ahead, and the certainty of that is always very comforting. I love seeing the seasons change beneath my feet, and I love kind of mentally logging when the figs will start coming through, and I love knowing that in late spring there will be fireflies filling the forest at night, and that in February the first leaves will start appearing on the fruit trees, and that the swallows will appear in the skies again, and that the wild boars will be turning over stones and digging up roots. These things will bring me comfort, and the same cycle every year with little nuances and changes. It feels like the most essential ritual or tradition, like a kind of mass, or something about it feels spiritual in the ritual of it, except it's completely natural and it just is and always will be regardless of who is noticing. My routine is also very affected by the seasons as well. I will admit less so now as we have upgraded our off-grid electricity system to something much better. Prior to that, pretty much once it was dark, it was the end of the day. Work stops and I can't create anything anymore because I don't have enough power for stronger lights. I do remember creating a painting actually almost in complete darkness because the weather was so bad and I could barely see what I was doing in the caravan even during the day. The painting remarkably turned out quite well. Once the sun sets, it also gets colder, obviously in winter, and it's like my work brain instantly shuts off. This used to bother me more, but now I really like this. I like that nature tells me whether I can work today or not, and thankfully the work I do is flexible in that way. I do think living off-grid would be quite stressful if you work 9 to 5 kind of job. Unless you have a very fancy and advanced setup, you're probably going to feel quite frustrated with that aspect. The last thing you want to do after a long day away from home is carry heavy jugs of water through some difficult terrain or slip up in the mud or something, and this has happened to me even when I was trying hard not to fall. Something I really experienced as well living in such a remote place was kind of unintentionally philosophical. I didn't know this would be something I would go through, but it was something I very much felt I had to pass through, and it was the question of who am I when nobody is looking? Who am I without external validation? Who am I when I have nothing and I am nobody? Living in a city, I did a lot of things in order to survive that I felt like I had to unlearn. A lot of those were based around my appearance because unfortunately how we look affects how we are treated. I had a part-time job that was extremely draining and had some really difficult customers, and also just in general that management at the job were really horrible and treated their staff poorly. In the streets outside and sometimes inside too, I saw a lot of sadness and untreated mental health problems every day, and it was a really tough thing to witness so often. I had to strike up a balance between being kind but also wanting to make sure I was safe and not being taken advantage of. A lot of my appearance and demeanour became a tool to make sure I was respected. It's funny because this is also something I adopted as a teen in order to kind of deflect any bullying as well. When I moved to the forest, I felt like I had to shed this part of myself, like some kind of husk or second skin. But I found it really hard, and often too much of our identity is wrapped up in the way others perceive us. I was unintentionally trying to shed this, I just didn't exactly know that's what was happening. It feels very much like taking a step into a black nothingness. It felt simultaneously like softening myself and hardening myself at the same time, strengthening certain parts while letting go of others. I knew that I was feeling a lot of weird things about my identity, my appearance, who I am when no one was looking. It was a gradual process that involved a lot of self-reflection, and not just about who I was, but about my art as well. I actually went through really quite the metamorphosis with my art during the pandemic. I think initially to cope with my inner struggles, I started to obsessively draw, and that's when I rediscovered using a dip pen and ink. I had been using just fine liners prior to this, and before that had been painting. I think if it wasn't for my inner journey and being allowed to take that journey due to living in a forest, I'm not sure I would have rediscovered this way of working and creating the art that I have made. For the first time in my life, my art just felt really, really right. Exactly what it should be, at exactly the right time, and in exactly the right way. I started something called Forest Journal, where I would document in some kind of illustration something I had seen here but in a more fantastical way, be it a hoof track, a wasp, or a beautiful flower. I used these as fuel for my imagination. I started revisiting fairy tales and researching folklore, and my life in the forest started to become intertwined with everything I created. Like nature was always trying to reclaim the forest, it was also reclaiming my creativity. During the pandemic, I wasn't able to travel to the UK to see any of my friends or family for years. It had been 4 years since I had seen my hometown. During that time, I lost 2 people close to me, My grandma and my cousin both passed away. I wasn't able to say goodbye to them or attend their funerals. I think this made it much harder to come to terms with the fact that they had gone. I was really sad I hadn't been able to see my grandma or my cousin before they passed. My grandma taught me to play piano when I was 6, and in a previous video I explained how she had taught me a little bit of how to paint with watercolours when I was a kid. She'd always been interested in my creative endeavours. During this period of time, I went for a lot of walk in the lands surrounding here and sat at a bench that looked out over the valley, and in these moments I kind of felt like the forest was with me. I think nature has a way of being so present, and it just is, and we can just be with it. At the time it was still painful, but I think it's these small moments that build up over time and heal us a little bit more each time. I think in the moment it can feel like we're not making any progress when we do these things, but I think small conscious moments like those can really do a lot over a long span of time. Living in a forest can also be quite brutal at times. I would say the good outweighs the bad, but we are very much at the mercy of nature. We have had trees die, and one morning I actually witnessed a gigantic pine tree fall. And I mean, this pine tree was bigger than a house. We are constantly battling against brambles and vines, which when we first came here, there was about 20 years worth of growth. Actually, the majority of the plants that grow here seem to be brutally spiky in some way or other. We also experienced a drought one year, and that felt very strange. As someone from the UK, experiencing just endless sun and no rain through the whole of winter and then summer was so strange, and it was strange for Portugal as well, really. And then some springs where it has rained so heavily that our stream is completely bursting out with water, and we have rivers of water running down our land. I remember one year, there just being a river of water flowing endlessly past the caravan. I actually hope that happens this year so I can film it and show you. I'm also very hyper aware that there are wild boars roaming these lands, and I'm always very cautious because if I stumble upon a female boar with piglets, she might become very aggressive. One year there was a wild boar hunt going on, and towards the end of the day I walked up to a hill to see if things were winding down, and I saw some dogs in the valley barking and running. What then emerged running up through the land was a huge boar. They ran through the forest in the valley, across the trail, and scaled the rocks onto our land and bulldozed their way through our gate, and then they were gone. It might be one of the most beautiful things I've seen, and it inspired this illustration that I'll show here. I called it Dreams of Jevely, because after this I kept having lots of dreams about wild boars, and Jevely means wild boar in Portuguese. I do occasionally feel a little spooked at night, especially if I'm here on my own, but really I think that's quite normal. I find I'm actually more afraid of a person suddenly looming from the dark than any animals or wildlife. The only thing that is a bit of a shame is that we aren't so far away from life that we don't suffer from light pollution. Although the skies can be quite clear in winter, the visibility isn't amazing most of the time, although I have seen a few shooting stars. I think part of why I became so interested in folklore was due to living so closely with nature. I really started to feel like I could understand how folklore and fairy tales were so important to especially country folk. They started to feel like more than just stories, and more like an integral way to understand humans and our relationship with our surroundings. I also watched a long interview with Joseph Campbell called The Power of Myth, and this really reignited my interest in these stories, and I would really suggest you watch it. It's really fascinating, and he is such a fascinating and such a warm person to listen to. Things feel quite different now because we do have science to explain a lot, but often I have seen and heard strange things that the forest brings, and I can understand why people created stories and myths around nature. Something about nature and animals feels inherently symbolic regardless of whether you believe they are or not, When I stumble upon a ring of mushrooms, somehow now it makes perfect sense to me why folk thought that it was a fairy ring, and entering it would mean the fairies would cause you to dance yourself to exhaustion and eventually your demise. I also think that when your entire livelihood and survival is so dependent on the weather, disease and animals, it makes sense that it would drive folk to create deities, rituals and traditions and superstitions all surrounding these. During the drought year here, I felt strangely tempted to pray to some kind of rain deity or create some sort of ritual to bring some water back into our lives, and although it meant I couldn't grow anything, it's not like I couldn't buy food and water from a store. These traditions and stories brought comfort to people who had nowhere else to turn for their survival. I obviously don't claim to understand exactly how they feel, but experiencing a small fraction of this, I think, is what caused me to feel so connected to folklore. There is also kind of a beautiful and absurd simplicity in some of it. If a sparrow enters a house, it is an omen of demise to one of the people who live there. And in some areas, it is believed that to avoid bad luck, any sparrow caught must be immediately unalived, otherwise the person who caught it will meet their demise. Or others, like in some areas, black rabbits are thought to host the souls of human beings. White rabbits are said to be really witches, and some believe that saying white rabbit on the first day of each month brings bad luck, and a common lucky charm is a rabbit's foot. I enjoy the absurdity of some of these as well. One of my favourites is based on a medieval English courtship ritual that lasted until the Elizabethan era. It was believed that if a woman soaked an apple in her own sweat and presented it to the person she desired, they would be exposed to her scent, therefore capturing the affections of the desired. In Austria, there was a slight variation, where women would keep slices of apples under their underarms while they danced. After the ball, they would offer the sweat-soaked slices to the person they had danced with and liked the most. The chosen would take a bite from the slice of apple offered. I actually created an illustration based on this. I guess I'll put it up on the screen just to show you. But yeah, I really liked that one. Even though in some ways it makes more sense than some of the animal folklore tales. And some of these folklore tales feel so convoluted and strange, and I was reading the other day in a book, I don't have an exact quote, but the writer was saying the more absurd the tale, it seemed the more ardently people seemed to believe in the tale, which I thought was quite interesting. Another aspect that is fascinating is how a lot of these stories and ideas are carried across cultures, either by coincidence or by stories travelling. Part of me really loves the idea of it being a coincidence, like a collective subconscious. I think it would be really fascinating if humans across the world experienced seeing similar phenomena and came up with similar stories to explain these. There is also a lot of diversity too, and don't get me wrong, I really love the fact that there is so much diversity across cultures, but there are a few stories that are remarkably similar. I really love reading about the Japanese yokai. The yokai are a class of supernatural entities and spirits in Japanese folklore. Some of these aren't even documented and actually only exist within a certain village or community. As I'm getting close to finishing this piece, I thought I would share some folklore about owls. I was actually a little surprised at how little I could find out about owls in relation to folklore, beyond what most people are familiar with. The owls are strongly associated with knowledge and wisdom. This seems quite ingrained in Western folklore. We often use the image of an owl for libraries or things relating to scholarly pursuits. In European folklore, the owl is strongly associated with more morbid symbology. If someone were to see or even hear an owl, this was often an omen of death or misfortune, so I guess I'm going to be experiencing a lot of misfortune as I am still being woken up and lulled to sleep by owls every day and night. In Greek mythology, the goddess Athena was strongly associated with wisdom and knowledge. Owls had a sacred connection to Athena, and Athena's owl had once been a woman named Nyctimene. Like many women in folklore and myths, Nyktimeni experienced horrendous abuse at the hands of her father and fled from him, and was found by Athena, who turned her into an owl, keeping her as a companion. Although I love the imagery this evokes, I can't help but feel from reading about this that Nyktimeni still remained in a kind of prison, having been turned into an animal that she might not have wanted to be. The story is written that she was benevolently turned into an owl and ranked the highest of Athena's animal companions, much to the jealousy of her crow. This is taken from Ovid's tale as a possible explanation, but others say that owls are associated with Athena because they are also symbolic of wisdom, although this still fails to explain exactly why, so I really loved Ovid's story of Athena and Nyktimeni. The Egyptians viewed owls as being incredibly important and revered, as they saw them as guardians of the underworld. In Native American culture, the owl has a very similar significance, and they often incorporate them into their rituals and storytelling. Usually the owl's role is one of guidance and wisdom with a connection to the spiritual realm. I think it's interesting how owls are portrayed across cultures in quite conflicting roles, and I'm sure a lot of that is to do with the ways in which we have experienced the animal. I read up about how many people, when seeing young barn owls, became extremely frightened due to their ghostly appearance, being all white and often nesting in lofts and barns with a kind of dishevelled appearance as many baby birds have. Owls make extremely varied sounds across species as well. Some make sweet hooting sounds, while others scream and shriek. They definitely have a magical and ethereal quality though, and I'm always excited to hear them. And this is the finished piece. I had a bit of a deadline to send this off before Christmas, so I definitely inked this quite a bit faster than I might usually. I really love the mountain detail I decided to add in the background, and I love how much these snowy owls stand out against the black ink. Thank you for joining me today and listening to a little about my life in the forest. I also have an online shop with prints and a self-published book and original paintings and drawings if you are looking for something new to add to a corner of your home. Take care.